Hi, and welcome back to the final day of the Azure SQL Bootcamp. We're so glad you have decided to join us once again in this fourth day of the week. My name is Anna Hoffman, and I'm a data and applied scientist on the Azure SQL team, and I'm also joined by Bob Ward, who is a principal architect on the Azure data team, and we're just really excited to be back.
Yeah, Anna, thanks. Great to be back. Our fourth day. Is this really the fourth day we've been doing this? I hope that so far you have seen a fairly extensive coverage of what Azure SQL is. We started with deploy and configure. What is Azure SQL? We've covered security, performance, and then yesterday, pretty cool deep dive into the built-in amazing functionality of availability and DR functionality for Azure SQL. And then, Anna, we had that kind of fun challenge that we did there, right? It'll be interesting today to kind of talk more about some of those scenarios and then kind of put a, wrap a bow around this. And then I think we're going to take questions today too. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. We have some time allocated at the end so that we can actually do an AMA and you can get all your questions answered related to SQL or Azure SQL or what's coming or anything else. And so as we get started today, what we're going to cover is really the solutions to the problems we talked about last session yesterday. So we'll talk about some submissions that we got from you all, as well as some knowledge check questions that will kind of get you thinking about potential solutions, along with some actual architectures that aren't exact solutions, but are some things that you might want to think about as you develop similar solutions. And then, like Bob said, we'll do a Q&A and we'll share more resources, as if this wasn't enough. We'll share more resources for how you can learn and get hands-on. Now, if you happen to be joining us for the fourth time, you're probably very familiar with what you're looking at on your screen. But if you are not, just a brief overview or reminder, we're doing all this on YouTube Live. So if you want to ask a question, depending on your browser, it will either be on the right-hand side of your screen or below your screen. And we have many moderators that have been joining us every day this week. We're very grateful for them for answering all your questions and sending some questions for us to feature. I'd also like to thank Rob Gibbons again for just a wonderful week of 4 days of streaming live and all the nonsense we kind of put you through. So we really appreciate it. And there are hands-on activities associated with everything that we've been doing. We talked a lot about these different resources throughout the week, but just to give a brief reminder, we have content on Microsoft Learn, a whole learning path where you can get hands-on, you can dive deep and read about a lot of the things we've been talking about, as well as use the free Azure Sandbox. We also have GitHub, which is where you can go and take all these materials, use them for your own training, training your customers, training your colleagues, training yourself. That's also where the slides for these sessions will be. And then we also have a YouTube series, Channel 9 series called Azure SQL for Beginners. If after this you want to come and learn more about one specific thing and you don't necessarily want to watch this whole video again, you can go, and we've broken out the bootcamp basically into 5-minute chunks, so you can go see whatever it is that might be helpful to you. So with that, I think we're just about ready to get started and talk about the scenario. Now, recall yesterday, I put Bob on the spot and we did a what to use when around a global content delivery network. And Bob kind of pointed out some things he thought would be useful for you all to think about as you go about your solutions. And now that we have seen this and people have had time to think about it, Bob, do you want to share a little more insight on some of the solutions that you might consider here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thanks for the hints yesterday. That was helpful as I was trying to read through these paragraphs. But a couple things that I talked about. Number one, you look at the word CLR right in the beginning, right? And we talked about surface area and instance level features. So if you think about that, there's only certain deployment options you can pick that are going to allow you to do that. You kind of got to start from there, right? You've got some regional things listed at the beginning paragraph here. So you need to be able to deploy things in various regions and allow the application to access data across those regions. And then you've got some latency IO things probably to consider because of the 1,000 writes per second type thing. So if you think about this, you've got the deployment option, surface area, instance level surface area you've got to think about to start with. Then you got to go think about, well, I got to pick some sort of tier or vCore or option that meets those kind of needs of like IOs per second. And then you've got the global piece, right? That's kind of the first part of all this. And then the second part is you got to go think about how, that's just getting everything deployed. Now I got to figure out how to authenticate. And you listed out several interesting things here. You said the main solution application will live in Azure. That's not bolded. But you have something in Azure that's going to connect to this. So you got a lot of different options when you're in Azure. But then you got several non-Azure clients and apps that need to connect to this. And so, but you're trying to eliminate these passwords as much as possible. So Azure AD is just going to be all over this last paragraph, right? Somehow. And you covered and talked about different various options with Azure AD. So you've got the deployment part, and the first thing you've got to consider some architecture with that. And then you've got to devise, how am I going to authenticate all the different users from these different clients? So that's kind of in my head when I was looking at this.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And, even as we looked at this and we were talking about this right before we went live this morning, some of this is kind of tricky. We didn't necessarily cover all of the things you would need to know here. So definitely something you would have to go and do some research on yourself. One pro tip I'll add, and maybe one of the moderators can go find this link and add it in the chat for you all, is there is a security best practices playbook for Azure SQL Database, which provides a lot of the information you might need for both of these scenarios. Again, that probably would have been a good hint to give to you all yesterday, but definitely go check out the security best practices playbook. It has a lot of great insights, and it's built by our security team that kind of sees the most common issues as well as the most complex type of issues. And we did get some responses, Bob.
Oh, really? Okay. I'm glad to see that.
Yeah, so we did get some responses, and I just want to throw up an example of one response. This one was pretty detailed. I was pretty impressed. This is by a guy named Fred. Sorry?
We got a diagram.
Yeah,
wow.
No, awesome. Pretty intense diagram. Bob, do you want to comment on some of the things that you see here and how you might interpret them?
Yeah, first of all, I love the fact that it's already global, right? You can just see somebody said, hey, I've got different regions I've got to deploy. And if you look right away in here, inside this is managed instance. We talked about surface area, right? So you have to have surface area managed instance to do CLR to get that SQL surface area. That is your only choice. You could do a VM, by the way, that's possible. But we even talked about platform as a service in the overall solution. And if you think about what we've discussed, we've kind of said that we believe that you're going to get such a great benefit of platform as a service that leaning towards that kind of first as your option is probably better, because there wasn't anything in there in the solution required about migrating from legacy SQL apps or anything like that, right? That wasn't there. So you got managed instance, you got the ability to do secondaries, you've got a global solution now to meet the needs across those things. Now I'm trying to look on here. It doesn't specifically say whether it's business critical or not. That might be a consideration, Anna. Wouldn't you agree? Because of maybe the requirements from the 1,000 writes per second, right?
Yeah, definitely. But it looks like maybe maybe Fred was implying business critical, because you do see that he says, you're using that read-only secondary in each region.
That's true. That's true. And remember, business critical in your primary region, that's the only way you get that read secondary using that option. So you're absolutely 100% right there. And then if you look at at the bottom here, recognizing you have on-premises assets, non-Azure assets that we said very clearly in authentication, Azure AD being a piece of this solution has to be considered. There's going to be some probably details within how do you make all that Azure AD stuff work, right? But yeah, and notice that also included here is traffic manager, load balancers. I'm assuming it says geo-replication here, but remember one thing we did talk about, Anna, correct me if I'm wrong here, but for managed instance, the geo-replication solution is called auto failover group, right? To do a managed instance. So this would technically be probably an auto failover group scenario, and you would be using the traffic manager and load balancers as part of that.
Definitely. And the other thing I wanted to call out, which I was pretty impressed with, is not only the Azure Traffic Manager, but suggesting things like ExpressRoute. This is something we didn't talk about at all. But ExpressRoute is basically a great way to get a direct line connection from your on-prem environment to Azure. So this is definitely going to help them with performance when we talk about getting, the I/O that they need.
It's a good example where somebody may give you a scenario like this, and you may pencil in answers that specifically meet the needs of those paragraphs. But the real right way to do this is to ask back questions first, right? So for example, we didn't say what the latency requirements for clients were, right? And that's why I like the idea that ExpressRoute was written here. But there could be costs. So ExpressRoute is more expensive. So one factor in all these scenarios is to discuss with your clients the costs involved, right? What does your data center look like today? Are you migrating? We didn't even talk about that in there. Like those are the kind of things that should be discussed. Are you doing a migration, new application? What kind of cost do you have to consider, balanced with the needs of performance? So.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks, Fred, for submitting.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, this is a great solution, and we're glad that you submitted it. Now we'll just take a second to kind of look at some questions. So you kind of seen an example of a potential solution. You've also seen the scenario, and Bob has talked through it a decent bit. So maybe now it's a good time to try to see how much of this is sinking in. So while you all are looking at these questions, Bob and I will talk about them a little bit more. So the first question is, which Azure SQL deployment option potentially offers the best fit for this scenario? So remember, Bob kind of talked about earlier the CLR requirement, which could really land you in two different places. But think about what might be best, or potentially, the most managed type of service that they could go to. Now, the second question says, how will they scale over multiple regions with multiple queries happening at the same time while isolating read workloads from write workloads? Now, this is, again, something that Fred got to in his architecture, so hopefully this is something that you kind of pick up on pretty quickly. And then the third question, and this is where, and there's also some more questions after this is where things start to get a little bit trickier because it's not something we covered in depth in this bootcamp. But the question is, which authentication method would you recommend for an application on an Azure virtual machine? So some important things to note here is that this is running in an application on an Azure virtual machine. So it is, connected to this Azure backbone, and there's some extra stuff that comes along with that.
You got really tricky here, Anna. I think you pushed, like, we didn't spoon feed these, right? I mean, this if you think about the knowledge checks we've done so far, we really were just saying, like, did you hear what we said about this one thing? This is really kind of putting a lot more together, and maybe even requires some research, in my opinion, looking at this.
Yeah, definitely. And it looks like from the questions, we might be having, the answers are starting to come in.
Okay.
It looks like we're getting B, C, D for the most part. So that would be landing in managed instance, BC, business critical with auto failover groups, and Azure AD authentication managed identity. Now, some people for question 3 are saying answer C, so Azure AD auth with MFA. Some people are saying A, but mostly we're getting B and C for the first 2 questions and D for the third question.
Yeah, if you think about that first question, again, let's just do the elimination process we did yesterday. Let's just try to go through that a little bit. So because of the surface area of CLR, you can just eliminate C and D already, right? So we just know it's not that. And you kind of hinted to the fact, Anna, on that first question, that A and B actually are possible, but you did say what is the best fit for this scenario. Imagine if you did A. Let's take that for a second, though. If you did A and had to build the rest of the geo solution, how would you go do that? That could be very difficult to manage and put together. And would you really meet the requirements of what was required in the application by doing that? You could, just to be clear here, you could, but it could be a chore to do that, right? And we never really did say anything like, you have to have DTC or something like that, which is something you don't get in a managed instance. So I would say B would probably be the best one on number 1, which a lot of people said B, right? That's good. Number 2, interesting one, right? Let's do some other eliminations here. We know we have to managed instance, right? So geo-replication falls off already. Remember, we just said that, right? You can only do auto failover groups with managed instance. Is that correct, Anna? I think we said that.
Yep.
So we got to take out B and we got to take out D. So now you have general purpose or business critical. And I think we just said already that, for business critical, you get a read workload in your region already. You do get a read workload in GP in the secondary, but you get that read workload for business critical. And therefore, I would say the answer's got to be C.
Very nice.
The last one's a little tricky. Let's just kind of talk this a little bit. So it's a recommended, by the way, let's be clear here. It's not what works. The question is what is recommended. And I think it's really important when it comes down to Anna, everything we've been teaching everybody. Mm-hmm. There are some questions that this works, and then there's some questions that are best for somebody or recommended. So you could do E, but is it really the recommended thing? Because remember, you did say, I want to eliminate passwords and hard-coded stuff like that, right? And this is the application in Azure. It doesn't say anything in here about legacy or anything like that, right? So I'd eliminate E. For me, I would eliminate C, actually, because I don't necessarily want my users going inside and connecting in the app in Azure VM and having to pull up their phone and which I have to do sometimes when I'm just doing a test, right? So I would actually take C out of the picture, and I would even take A out of the picture because I don't necessarily I don't want to require them to log in to this thing with their account, which is required for integrated. So it comes down to B or D. And as it turns out, when you talked about the playbook, managed identities are kind of like that preferred method, the best preferred method when you're using a resource in Azure. So I would pick D, actually.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. Just looking back at the questions, it looks like most people are on board with this one. So that's great.
It's a really good call out, Anna, because we did spend time in security talking about Azure AD, but we just gave you the fundamentals, right? We really did. I think you even did a demo where you use MFA or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. Which is fine for a demonstration, but you're giving a recommendation for an application for a customer to build in Azure. So we have great resources. That security playbook is a great resource, but this is where you would take your time a little bit and make sure you're actually giving the right solution for a customer using Azure AD, and potentially, Anna, even involving a lot of corporations that are larger have security teams, right? This is probably where you got to bring your security team in and then have a review over, is this really the best method to secure your assets and resources for your organization?
Definitely. Now, we do have a few more questions related to some of the different ways of connecting. But before we did that, I wanted to show one example, which is not directly related to this problem, but something that you might consider in a similar problem. Now, what you're seeing is a few things. Let's consider this is a managed instance, okay? So each of these clusters would represent managed instance, but since you kind of have an always on availability group there, this would be a business critical managed instance. So this is kind of similar, and they're using an auto failover group type of system, but what's different is one way to potentially get around the max size limits that exist today for managed instance. Remember that hyperscale is not currently available for managed instance. So what they're doing here, what's something clever you might do, is create a view which contains data from both managed instances, allowing you to basically obtain information from that larger set of data. So this is just another example. This came out of the documentation, so you can see this as well. But just another example of how you can start to apply what you've learned to these real-world scenarios. Now we have some more questions, Bob. You think they're up for it?
Anna, you are challenging folks today. I like it, though. It's good. This is really going to make you think. And by the way, if you're going through these questions and you're like, I have no idea, remember, this is all about learning. So you're going to learn by how we eliminate some things and we talk about things. And this is gets really interesting about the recommendations, not necessarily what works. What is the recommendation? So yeah, let's go through them.
Sure. Awesome. Okay. So if we think back to our scenario, there were basically applications running in different places. We already talked about the application running on an Azure virtual machine, and we said manage identities is kind of the recommendation for Azure resources.
Right.
Now this one says, which authentication method would you recommend for the application that's on a non-Azure machine? So think about that one. Maybe think about what I just said. And then for the question 5, it says, which authentication method would you recommend for SQL admin tools? So these are things like SSMS or PowerShell on a non-Azure machine. Now, again, some of these answers to the questions might depend on whether or not you can federate with Azure. So that's something that might make these questions a little tricky, depending on how you interpret that. And the final question is, which authentication method would you recommend for the application on for the legacy application where you cannot change the driver or the connection string on a non-Azure machine? So I think I have a little typo in that one, but just read that one carefully and think about it. If you can't change the connection string on a non-Azure virtual machine, where does that leave you? So
yeah,
let me
really should see what people say on these. This is not easy, right? This isn't simple answers.
So someone said, but it looks like the answers are starting to trickle in. I'm seeing a lot of B's for the first one. So that would be using Azure Auth with a client ID or certificate.
Okay.
For the question 5, I'm seeing a lot of C's. So that would be interactive with MFA. And for question 6, I'm seeing pretty much exclusively SQL Auth username and password.
Okay. So you're seeing a lot of B's for the first one. You're seeing some C's for the second one, and you're seeing E for the last one. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing. And it seems like maybe some people are interpreting the question as being a non-domain joined Azure machine, which would, of course, change the answer depending on how you interpret that.
Sure. Yeah, we didn't really say, if you remember correctly, I'm not even sure we said that in the scenario. So let's go through this a little bit, because for 4 and 5, maybe that's your question. You should be talking to, so a couple things. Let's just take 4, for example. This is an app, not the tools. So in the app, you probably would like to avoid changing the app as much as possible, right? So for example, and you want to avoid E. Let's just take 4 and 5 together kind of a little bit, right? So I don't want to do E in both of those. You said, as much as possible, Anna, eliminate passwords and hard-coded stuff, correct? So I'm just going to eliminate E out of the gate. And on 4, since this is the app, I can't use D. I can't use D in either one because it's not an Azure resource. You said to me, managed identities have to be an Azure resource. So I've already limited D and E. I got 3 left. So with multi-factor authentication, to be clear, it is possible actually in both cases. But again, remember, you're providing the need for the user to go do a second step to go do that. It may not be the best recommended method, but it could be. B is probably going to require an app change, and it's not going to be possible in SSMS. So I can't do B on 5, and I could do B in 1, but it may not be the best. What I would say to the customer is, are these domain joined machines? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, I pick A for both because I don't change the app. It's already set up to do integrated security. You know what I'm saying? You normally have the app, or you can use SSMS in that manner. And I'm already domain joined. Mm-hmm. So I would probably pick A in both 4 and 5.
Yep. And I think what happened with 4, the reason we saw so many Bs, just to reiterate, is because if you assumed that this was not a domain joined or federated machine, then A would not be possible.
Right. Exactly. So you could do B. It's very possible. And so that's actually, so if people said B, I think that's a valid answer that they made, because if it's not domain joined, they'd have to do B, right?
Yep.
But you can't do B in number 5. So by the way, Anna, just to let you know, if it's not domain joined, I'm having a hard time this morning saying that. It's not Friday yet, is it? Domain joined machine. If you can't do that in number 5, then C might be a good one, because SSMS is supported to do MFA. What
Awesome.
about number 6?
Yeah,
Um,
so let me,
yeah, go
oops.
ahead.
So it looks like we're getting a lot of D's, but a few B's
No, which one is this question?
for question 6.
Question 6. What authentication would you recommend for the app on a legacy app where you can't change the connection string? So if you can't change the connection string, it's a legacy app. I hate to tell you this, but A through D are not going to be the answer, right?
Right.
So because the legacy app's not going to be using Azure AD. So the only possible answer is E, even though you're trying to, it's a non-Azure machine, right? So obviously you can't do D. But yeah, since it's that legacy app, E, and you were trying to eliminate hard-coded information. You said that, but this is one where they cannot change the driver connection string. So I would say E has to be the answer, actually. Be interesting to see if
Awesome.
anybody says differently.
Yeah, it seems like mostly people are saying that. Maybe some people overlooked that changing the connection string part.
It's a great example, though, Anna, of you taking each of those scenarios, working with your customer to draw out what are the possible options and how do you eliminate things that they can or cannot do, and what's the best recommended solution.
Exactly. And, this slide just kind of aims to show you all those solutions that we mentioned. You notice the ors come into the picture just like we did when we were discussing, because it is going to depend on the exact scenario that you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
So these are all of the different things you had to account for and the different answers that we came up with. So hopefully this was an interesting exercise. Again, we recognize this was a challenging one. Even ourselves, like we had to go look up a few things to make sure we were talking about this.
It's a good one. Very good exercise.
Awesome. So we will continue on to the second scenario, which was a mission critical application. Now, recall Bob talked about a few tips yesterday. I highlighted a few tips around the SLA they're going after, things like data sovereignty, and then a big thing about DBAs seeing sensitive data and how you can kind of not only limit them from seeing it, but also audit and manage and understand if anyone is accessing it. So Bob, do you have any tips or extra thoughts now that we're about to go through some questions?
Sure. So remember the SLA thing we talked about yesterday, right out of the gate. You have pretty specific options you have to pick to meet that. It's pretty specific deployment options that are only going to meet that requirement. Data sovereignty, again, is a regional thing. So you have to think about whether there are privacy or compliance issues going on with the region you are. So you need to pick a deployment option based on the first one that is in a region that supports sovereignty for your needs. And then if you look at the bottom part of this, there are several different things in here and flavors of what we're asking you to do. If you look at it very carefully, you can see the word sensitive, you can see users, map to AD. Look at that second one. And you remember yesterday I was talking about troubleshoot performance using the portal. So you might be focused on the word performance, Anna, but let's go back and read the context of the sentence. At the same time, DBAs need to be able to troubleshoot performance using the portal. That could imply RBAC, if you think about it. Because remember, you're using resources outside SQL, and you need to give permission to somebody to look at something outside SQL. So actually, it turns out sensitive data, this feels like a very security-related set of concepts in the second paragraph to me.
Yeah, definitely. And again, this is something you might consider using the security playbook for as
Absolutely.
well, because this is something that we commonly see, right? You want to limit access to sensitive data and even track that, but then DBAs need certain permissions, but not all the permissions, obviously. Now, we did have one question come through that Stephen asked, is this scenario available somewhere? And the answer is yes, you can find these scenarios in the slides on GitHub, in the actual GitHub Markdown pages for Module 6, as well as in the Microsoft Learn content. So you can definitely come back to these scenarios later and maybe dive deeper and look at that as well. And I believe we have a link on the screen to help you with that as well. I'm going to throw up the questions for the first round of this, but before we talk about them, I'm going to ask one more question related to the previous scenario. So Bob, Mikhail asks, can we replace the CLR requirement in the first scenario with, I'm guessing they meant threat protection offered by Azure?
Yeah, the CLR requirement's an application requirement, right? So specifically in this case, it's possible, I suppose it's possible, that if you really talk to your customer, it could be a CLR requirement for an app outside of SQL. But in this particular case, they're talking about CLR requirements inside SQL. So SQL CLR being something that they need to have. Now, it's fair though, I think actually. I love that you asked this question, because why not go ask the customer and say, now, why do you need SQL CLR again? Right, Anna? Like you could. And because maybe Azure Database is something you'd rather do and not managed instance. And so maybe the customer says, well, this is what I'm doing for SQL CLR from an app point of view. And you're like, oh, you know what? There is a different alternative for that. It does require potentially an app change, could be better for you, right? So if it's threat protection, I don't know necessarily if that applies here, because I don't, we're not implying that SQL CLR, it was a content delivery network system. So probably that's not it.
Right.
But I do love the fact that the question was asked, can we replace the requirement with something else? So it's fair to say that you have to use SQL CLR and then decide whether you have to still use managed instance.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great call out, because depending on a customer's scenario and also, the length of time that they have to maybe either migrate or build this application, they might have a different answer.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's take a look at these questions. Now, the first question is, which Azure SQL deployment option potentially offers the best fit for this scenario? So again, you're going to want to think about some of the things we talked about related to this scenario. Maybe a hint would be their SLA. Maybe that might help. Then the second question is, what is the best option for them to enable geo-redundancy and maintain high availability? And the third question is, what role does co-location play in your solution?
Interesting. Let's see what we're getting here.
Yeah, so let's see. We just have a few answers coming in so far.
Okay.
Maybe we'll give folks a few more seconds to take a look at the question and think about their answers. Bob, in your experience, have you had a lot of issues from support where people have issues setting these things up, setting up things like geo-replication or auto failover groups?
Yeah, never, right? No, of course, remember, people don't call support and say, I'm happy, things are great. But again, just to emphasize, if you have to go set up yourself in your data center, or even with Azure VM, a complete geo-replicated system, this is not a trivial exercise, as many people know, right? So yeah, if you just take availability groups for a second in SQL Server, probably one of the number one question that comes up is just configuring the thing and maintaining and getting it set up. It's great technology. And then past that, you've got to go monitor this thing and make sure it's set up for failover correctly and get your app connected and so forth. So for Azure SQL, not so much, right? But for SQL Server itself, absolutely. The maintaining high availability and setting it up and configuring it the right way to meet your needs, especially in a geo-distributed way, is a fairly complex thing to do.
Thanks, Bob. And yeah, I would agree. It's, one of the big benefits that we see in moving to Azure is you just kind of deploy business critical, for example, and get an always on availability group.
Yeah. And we're not saying that you're not going to have things that you need to monitor. That's why we talked yesterday about monitoring availability, by the way. We still want to give you tools to monitor what you've set up, but it's our intention that we've greatly reduced the need to do that and maintain it.
All right, so let's take a look. It looks like we're having quite some variance in our answers.
Okay.
I'm seeing a lot, for the first question, a lot of C's and a few D's. So do we want to start with that first question?
Sure. We didn't really say there was a need for a pool. And I'd have to double check, by the way, whether the SLA requirements are even allowed for a pool. But let's talk about the first two. So we said 9, what was it, 4.5 nines? Is that correct? What we said? So we said to get 4.5 nines, you needed business critical with an availability zone. I'm pretty sure that's what you said on your diagram, right? So availability zones only available today for databases. So A and B are out the door. Remember, professionally fit for your scenario. So A, by the way, just to be clear about A, it might be possible for you to do that, but you're responsible for the SLA, not us. So Azure can't provide you that SLA with just using VMs. So you would have to be responsible for maintaining the 4.5 nines. I want to be very clear and hyper-focused about my answer, right? B can't be possible because availability zones don't exist for that today. So it's either got to be C or D. And we didn't really even talk about the need to have hundreds of databases. That was not even part of the solution. So I would say C is probably your best answer.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think you got it spot on, and I think most of our folks have got that as well. Okay, so let's take a look at what we're getting for the second question.
Yeah, this will be interesting.
It looks like a lot of Bs.
Okay.
Mostly Bs, but there are some As as well.
Okay. So let's talk about this, by the way. Remember, Anna is, as any professor does, wording a question very interestingly. It doesn't say what is the option for them to enable geo-redundancy. It says what is the best option. So let's go back and talk about the options yesterday that Anna talked about. Geo-replication's a great option, right? But I don't remember there being requirements for read secondaries, a bunch of them in your region. Okay, you didn't get specific there. Plus, geo-replication requires two things: manual failover, right, and changing connection strings. So to be as highly available as possible to kind of reduce that, auto failover, which is possible, of course, in this case, for you to be able to do. You know, I wonder if people, if you go back and look at that diagram, I want to make sure people are not equating auto failover, Anna, with managed instance. Because managed instance, that is your only option. You can't do geo-replication, but for Azure Database, you can do both of these options, correct?
Right.
So to me, auto failover is the best option because I get the highest available scenario because I got auto failover. I don't have to change my connection tree for my app. I still get read secondaries. I get all those kind of type things. So to me, A could be an option, but the best option would be B.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. And yes, I was trying to be tricky there with the key to me is the maintain high availability, right? Because like Bob mentioned, you know, you want to be able to auto failover if we detect something is wrong. And another cool thing that you might not remember from the availability, or maybe you do, is Bob mentioned there are ways that you can actually query this thing to make sure the status is up and running. I believe there are some DMVs. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you have DMVs available to take a look at these things. There are monitoring capabilities both from Azure interfaces and from T-SQL to go monitor this. Absolutely.
Awesome. Now, if we take a look at the third question, what role does co-location play in your solution? If I take a look at the answers, I'm seeing mostly C's, but also a few B's and one A.
Okay. You know, I was going back and looking at this scenario again, and your main mission is to ensure that the app is designed and deployed with the appropriate data redundancy and fault resilience to meet the availability and data sovereignty goals. Do you remember that sentence? So that's pretty important when it comes to 3, in my opinion, because if that's the case, the app is designed and deployed with appropriate redundancy, right, and fault tolerance and data sovereignty. So A to me doesn't apply then because of that, right? And then for B, auto failover just doesn't give you what you need for any application redundancy like that. Again, remember, you get application abstraction, but not redundancy. So for me, C has to be the answer because of that requirement that's listed here in the scenario.
Yeah, and I think this really, you know, calls back to what we had talked about. I think it was yesterday when we said, is your application ready? Because, you know, this isn't just about the database. If you have to fail over, you know, say from East US to West US, and you want to maintain that high availability, but, you know, now your database is in West US and your application is in East US, you're going to introduce some extra latency. So the only way you can really get around this is having your application in both regions. And this is actually a place where you could use something like Traffic Manager to make sure you reroute the traffic from the application to the secondary region in the case that a failover occurs. Now, again, we do have, this isn't per se the exact solution for this scenario, but this is something potential that you could consider when you think about it. So a few things on here which I can talk to. So note, if you look at point 1, basically we're using business critical. So you see those secondaries throughout. Maybe there should be one more secondary there. And then what you're also seeing is that we're using zone redundancy, right? So that's why you see availability zone 1, 2, and 3, and you see those replicas are kind of spread around it. You also see that your application, so you see web app 1 and web app 2, it's deployed in both regions. So again, this is going to provide a redundant copy of that database if you have to do some sort of failover. Also with 3, I mentioned using traffic manager with this thing called priority routing method. And this is going to allow you to basically redirect immediately if any sort of failure occurs. In 4, what you're kind of seeing is that we're really just pointing to that listener of the auto failover group. So that's really going to help us, again, in the case that a failover happens, we don't have to change any connection strings. And then finally on this page, we do see we're picking 2 regions, but one key call out there is that you want to make sure both regions do support availability zones. Otherwise, you're not going to have the highest availability in both of those regions. Now, if we think about if a failover, what's that? Sorry? Oh, sorry, Bob. If we think about if a failover has to occur, you can do something like activating a force failover just to make sure all of this stuff works. And what's going to happen is it's going to automatically update because of the way you set up your traffic manager. So what you see in point 7 is it's going to detect that outage and switch it to the other application. So this is, again, going to help you achieve that highest availability SLA. Bob, I'm sorry if I cut you off a little bit earlier. Do you have other things you want to add to kind of thinking about a mission critical application?
Well, I just want to call back again what you talked about the application, because the focus is always on the database and the server. That's what I do for a living. I mean, I'm a server database person, right? But often it's the application part of this is always missing from this conversation. So I love the way you kind of included the idea of ensuring that the application is part of the overall solution, because and often you watching today are going to be looking at Azure SQL as part of your deployment, and it is actually a very, very good point, because it calls out your need to be able to work directly with people that are writing that app together as a single solution. And often we've seen that problem happen when people are deploying things of this scale, that they're not working together with app development teams to ensure the app is fault tolerant in line with the requirements of what's going on at the database level.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Bob. So now if we move on, and we're going to stay with the same scenario, but we're going to shift gears and try to think about the DBAs. Remember, there are a few things we were trying to do. Ensure that DBAs can't access sensitive data. We can track the access, and we can, also allow DBAs to do their jobs. They still need to be able to have access to troubleshoot performance, whether it's in the portal or creating new users in a tool that's not the portal. So if we look at question 4 reads, how can you ensure that DBAs cannot see sensitive data stored in specific columns? There are a few options here, and this could be tricky and interpreted in a few ways, and perhaps there's a stretch in my answer, but we'll talk about it. And then for question 5, it says, how can you track access to tables containing sensitive data? And this is probably going to be pretty easy if you completed the hands-on exercises, because you kind of went through how you would actually do this. And then question 6 is, how can you allow DBAs to be able to troubleshoot performance via the Azure portal and SSMS and create new contained database users with Azure AD principles? So just remember, one thing there is creating contained database users specifically with Azure AD. So that was something we talked about yesterday as well. Bob, do we want to go ahead and kick it off and we can start talking about question 4? I'm
Yeah.
seeing a lot of C's and a few D's.
Okay. C's and a few D's. Okay. Right. Okay. What about 5? What are you seeing there?
For 5, I'm seeing a good mix of answers. Let's see.
Mix. Okay.
Yeah, maybe C, D, and A. So not a lot of B, but everything else.
I'm sorry, on 5, you're seeing A, C, and D.
Yep.
Okay. No B's. All right. What about 6? Very interested to see what people say about 6.
For 6, I'm seeing mostly C's. Again, this is one where I took some liberty to make a question tricky, and
You
some
are
D's.
really tough on these knowledge checks today. I don't know what you were doing when you built the knowledge checks for today. Were you mad at the TT Titans or something? I mean, wow.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm hoping it will help us spark some interesting discussion.
Of course.
Because they aren't all, like we've said, there aren't all cut and dry type of answers.
Discussion between us, for sure. Right? What do you see? So in 6, you're seeing C, I guess, right?
A lot of C.
Okay.
Also, some of everything else.
This is good. It's a great conversation. Let's go back to 4 first, okay? How can you ensure that DBAs cannot see sensitive data stored in specific columns? So, first of all, data classification is something that you could actually look at, right? About sensitivity. Remember, it was all about sensitivity. So, to me, always encrypted is available as well to make sure somebody can't look at data, whether it's sensitive or not. It's an encryption scheme, right? So if that's the case, it can't be D. Sorry, excuse me. Hold on a second. Before I say my answer. So when I first looked at this, I thought to myself, okay, it can't be D because, and then I thought, oh no, she didn't mean none of the above. She meant all of the above. So then I looked at A, SQL audit. Now SQL audit's an interesting one. And this is where, Anna, I think you're stretched a little bit, right? So audit is used in combination with classification in some cases for sensitivity. So, and it can't just be audit on its, first of all, it just can't be audit on its own. And it can't be classification on its own. And it can't be encrypted on its own. So if you look at more from that perspective, the only possible answer is going to be D. But I can see where somebody could look at this and say, auditing doesn't ensure I can't see data. It's just a way for me to track whether I'm seeing sensitive data. What would you say, Anna?
Yeah, no, I think that's totally fair. I guess I was probably expecting to see a little bit more of, I guess there's no dynamic data masking up here as well either.
Right. Which
is kind of what I might think the answer might be related to.
But if you think about this, so again, B and C are both possible, right? If you just do process elimination here, B and C are possible, but you don't have a choice for B and C, and it can't just be B or C. It's got to be D. It's the only possible thing. But I can understand where somebody's look at this and say auditing on itself is not going to prevent it, right? But in combination with it, it could be. Very tricky.
All right, let's take a look at question 5. How can you track access to tables containing sensitive data?
Yeah, so let's take a look at it. If you think about this a little bit, tracking access to table containing sensitive data is not a feature of dynamic data masking, right? Dynamic data masking being a way for you to protect somebody viewing something versus querying something. So B and C are now eliminated, correct? Now, if you want to track access to tables containing sensitive data, you do need to use SQL audit, but you don't get to do that on its own. You must use data classification in order to set up what tables have sensitive data. And remember, data classification is a feature where you, through the portal or through T-SQL, you mark what columns are considered sensitive. So you do that first, then you set up audit, and if you have auditing turned on, you can then track who is accessing those things. So for me, A would have to be the answer. Is that what we got? Have we got a lot of A's out there on this one?
Yep. Yeah,
Good.
I would say we got a lot of A's, but we also got some D's, which I could understand why we got a decent number of D's.
But it's important though to call out for those that you said D, and we're not shaming you. We're just saying that if you are looking at tracking, if you're just looking to track access to tables, D is perfectly acceptable, right? But if you want to specifically track access to sensitive data and see the fact that it was sensitive data that you called out, then A would be your best answer.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important call out, an important nuance for people to realize. Now, when we look at the question 6, it looks like we have a lot of C's and a few D's and maybe like 1 or 2 A and B.
This is really important to break out the process for setting up what Anna talked about, in my opinion, Anna. So number 1, you said, how can you allow DBAs to be able to troubleshoot performance via the portal? So out of the gate, you have to use RBAC, right? We talked about that. So B's in the running right now, right? Now, in order to do this, and through the portal and through SSMS, first of all, if you're going to use the portal, you need RBAC. If you're going to use SSMS, you have to be authenticated as a valid user for the deployment, correct? So it's possible, by the way, that you could, I just want to work through this a little bit. It's possible just from that first part that you could do like a server admin. You could set up a server admin for your deployment, and you would tell the DBAs, hey, here's the server admin. But that wouldn't make a lot of sense, right? Now, you also want to allow these DBAs to create new contained users with AD principals. So in order to do that, you need to make these DBAs an admin on the logical server, because you got to give them access to go create these users. So given the choices here, because I don't see a choice for like just use the server admin that's in SQL auth, I need to use AD groups, right, to give a group of DBAs RBAC permission, right? And I could use one of the built-in RBAC contributor roles, Anna, by the way. And I also need to make this AD group an AD server admin to the logical server. Therefore, that was not part of the choice here. So I can see where somebody would say C, because it's implied that I'm going to do that step, but D is the correct answer. And I'm sure you're going to get somebody to say, like, is Professor Anna, is she just, she's just like my college professor? Because
yeah, just the worst.
It's the worst, right? So honestly, I'm really being serious here. I can see where somebody says C, because it is true that the combination of those could be used to do all of these things. But what is missing from this step is to assign the AD group as to being a server admin for the logical server, which is something you can do, right?
Yeah, definitely. And we also have kind of a summary of an example of how you might do something like this. Again, this isn't an exact solution. This is just something we pulled that might help you understand how some of these things work. So in this case, what you see is you have a SQL DBA group, and this group contains the Active Directory admin, like Bob was mentioning, and it also has the SQL Server contributor role, which is going to allow the DBA to do various, admin type of tasks. But then in addition, you have a separate group, the SQL Data Owner group, and this is going to allow certain DBAs to actually be able to write to that SQL database. And then we threw in this idea of leveraging Azure Key Vault. Potentially, you could do this with Always Encrypted with the master keys. And again, with this option, you can either bring your own key or you can let us kind of cycle those keys for you.
Well, I like this slide. It's really good.
Awesome. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break. And then after the break, we're going to learn what else should I know. And you're not going to want to miss this, because Bob is going to go deep into some core SQL Server things you'll be wondering about that we haven't covered yet in this workshop. Then we're going to stretch you to other opportunities in Azure. We talked mostly about Azure SQL, but once you're there, what's next? And finally, but definitely not the least thing, we're opening it up to an AMA, and we already have some questions that are building in our queue. So I think that'll be really interesting. But until then, let's just take a 5-minute break, and we'll see you soon. Welcome back. Thanks for sticking around. We do have some questions building up in our queue, but what I will say is we're going to hold them till the Ask Me Anything section, which is just a few slides away. We have a few more things to cover. I mentioned this about what else should I know, and what else when it comes to Azure SQL. So I'll pass it off to our SQL guru, Bob, who is hyper-focused and has hyper-focusedness this week to talk about what else should we know.
Can you say that 3 times real fast?
No.
Yeah, I know. So here's the deal. We started our journey with what is Azure SQL. And as Ann and I talked about building all of this content, we knew we had to start with deploy and configure. We knew that we had to talk about those meat and potatoes. We needed to do security, performance, and availability. And we wanted to do these scenarios. Anna was very passionate about that. I just love the way it's been presented. It's really challenged folks to think about it. And then imagine this behind the scenes. Starting in, Anna, I don't know, January, right? We've started building these OneNotes of all these details that we're talking about Azure SQL, comparing it to SQL Server. And I'm, hyper-focused. So I'm going along and saying, well, what about this? What about this? And I'm putting all these notes in here. Then we put all the content together. And I had this OneNote page with all this stuff. Nana goes, what's this stuff? And I said, well, it's what else somebody should know that's not necessarily tied directly to those topics that we just covered. And so I feel pretty passionate that somewhere before we're done, we need to cover those because it could be important to people to understand what's possible in Azure SQL and how's it compared to SQL Server. And so I came up with this list. There could be others, but it all starts with job management. SQL Server Agent being that great capability that's been in SQL Server for so many years. People using that on their own to schedule things like T-SQL jobs, automated things to do, could be rebuilding indexes, it could be other types of maintenance things. Or we use SQL Server Agent to do things like replication behind the scenes. So part of Cloud Lifter Managed Instance was to bring that functionality to the table. So you're going to love the fact that with a managed instance, you can go right into Management Studio and then start adding the jobs that you need and even putting mail and alerts on top of those kind of type capabilities. What about for Azure SQL Database? I mean, it's unfair that I can't schedule things with that. And it turns out we have a service called Elastic Jobs, where you will go and use a new Azure service called Elastic Jobs. You will supply another Azure SQL database to be the metadata of your Elastic Jobs. You think about it, SQL Server Agent has its own metadata to store job information called MSDB. Elastic Jobs needs that same metadata. You'll set up your metadata database, you'll point your service to that, and then you'll use a series of T-SQL procedures against that metadata database to create your jobs. And then you'll have something called targets, and targets are the Azure SQL database deployments you'd like to run these jobs against. Now here's what's really cool. You can set up a series of databases and take your job and run these in parallel. So it's a very valuable service. It's all around T-SQL, so anything you can do in T-SQL against those targets, you need to set up all the right permissions. We have some nice tutorials available for you to set that up. And then finally, you're in Azure. So if you'd like to do things outside of the scope of this, there's something called Azure Automation, where you can even do things like run Python scripts. Basically, anything you can do to connect to a TDS connection, you can do in Azure Automation. And you might want to consider combining things that you're doing against your Azure SQL deployments with other Azure resources in the case of Azure Automation. Now, there's some other capabilities in SQL Server that or in Azure SQL compared to SQL Server. It's pretty important to point out. Polybase is a feature we announced in SQL Server 2019 with a concept called external tables. That functionality of the complete Polybase is not yet available in Azure SQL. We're really looking really hard. A lot of people have asked us about that. It's something we'd really like to do. However, the concept of doing an external table is available in an Azure SQL database. And in fact, it's kind of a way that you could set up to do a cross-database query across Azure SQL databases. And there's a couple of examples that we have in the documentation for you to do that. Now, linked servers and actual cross-database querying is very, very popular today in SQL Server environments. And for Azure Managed Instance, since you have a SQL Server instance, you get those capabilities. Now, the linked servers are limited to SQL Server providers, but what we see a lot of customers using that functionality, it's going to work really well in your managed instance. Database mail and service broker, again, service level, surface level, instance level type capabilities. You get that functionality with a managed instance, and database mail, of course, works quite well when working with, say, SQL Server Agent. Now, full text search is interesting. We've had full text search in SQL Server for many, many releases, and that is available both for Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance. But before you go down that path, you might want to consider looking at Azure Search. Azure Search being another Azure service that can well integrate with Azure SQL Database. And it's actually also called Azure Cognitive Search. So there's some built-in machine learning capabilities that you could put on top of your search indexing with your Azure SQL deployments. So take a look at Azure Search Integration if you're considering down that full text search route. Machine learning services is a functionality we released in SQL 16 and SQL 17 and continue to enhance in SQL 19. And today, we have available in preview the ability to do machine learning service models with a managed instance. Now, one question I do get about things that are not supported, and there are a few things that are not supported, I'm not listed here, but two that stand out. One is XP Command Shell and one is distributed transactions. I would say that distributed transactions are something that we're taking a look at for managed instance right now to support. You should know, though, that we have documentation in Azure how you can write a distributed transaction application. You will not be using MSDTC here. You'll be using different transaction management services. So it's still possible to build an application to do that. But DTC, like a begin distributed transaction in a managed instance, is not available yet. People have asked me about XP Command Shell a lot, and it's not available today in Azure SQL. But you know what, quite frankly, a lot of people I run into in their SQL Server deployments choose to actually do this through XP Command Shell and restrict it on their SQL Server, even on premises, because it does open up a surface area for somebody to run commands at the Windows Server level, potentially with permissions that you don't want. You can block it, you can control access to it, but I'm not even sure when we would open up that store procedure in Azure SQL. We really don't have plans to do that today. There are options for you to do other things. You could run SQL CLR, for example, in managed instance, or you could run other types of Azure services to do command type of activities. So finally, let's talk a little bit about errors. I think it's kind of interesting here. I was in support for many years, and so pretty familiar with this area. And I'll talk about the second bullet point first. So there's this thing called stack dumps in SQL Server, and maybe some of you have seen me through the years bring up stack dumps in a session and use a debugger or something. The whole idea is that the SQL Server engine is smart enough to detect fatal exceptions and produce some diagnostic information when those occur. And in some cases, these are faults of SQL Server, and then we create fixes for them. And what happens in your on-premises environment, if these occur, is that you need to usually open up a support case with support, send these stack dumps to the support team, and then we debug these things and then create a fix or analyze the problem. You should know that we monitor all this behind the scenes. If these get triggered, it automatically kicks off potentially, depending on the severity of the exception, a failover and or an investigation by our engineering team to actually go in and automatically fix these in the next train. This is the beauty of the versionless system of Azure SQL. Now, from an error perspective, we've got a link for you available that you can take a look at. There are new errors specific to Azure SQL. Let me call out a couple of these. Today in SQL Server, when you have a SQL that's not available, and let's say it's in the middle of a failover concept, typically when you connect, you're just going to get a connectivity type error, and then you retry your application. In Azure, if our gateway services are available, you technically can connect. It's just that the backend services aren't available. So you might get an error message. And in fact, when Anna was doing her availability test, those were the error messages that were coming up to indicate that, hey, we're failing over, but connectivity is fine. That could be important for you because you want to know for a fact from an application point of view, is it an overall network problem just getting to Azure, or is it something in the server in itself that I'm trying to get access to? Now, I mentioned some things about resource limits, like limiting worker threads or worker connections. And so in SQL Server, what is the behavior of running out of worker threads, right? It's like a thread pool wait. There is no error condition for this, but in Azure, we have that. So if we, in Azure SQL Database, limit a certain number of concurrent workers, you will get a well-known error message. It could apply to other limits as well. And then you can take action based on that or track that and decide, do I need to change my worker limits or go take a look at my application? So there are a list of errors specific to Azure SQL, and I think it's important you understand what those look like, have your app be able to handle those, and be able to decide from a supportability perspective, how do I want to treat these in my deployment? So Anna, that's a little bit of a flavor of what else you need to know, and it's not specific to everything we've covered, but I think to round out your knowledge of Azure SQL, especially if you're a SQL Server expert, it's kind of important to know these.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for sharing all of this with us. Bob, as we kind of wrap up and we think about all the stuff we've talked about, it's really all been related to how you translate this deep knowledge that you have of SQL Server to Azure SQL. But there's a little bit more than just Azure SQL when you move to the cloud. And we just wanted to call out briefly that you now have, pretty nice integrations between lots of services in Azure. And this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just a few that, I've kind of played around with before. But, really Azure SQL can become, like we've mentioned before, the world's database. It can be the backend for lots of your applications, regardless of what you're doing, whether you're doing IoT or finance, or you're doing some analytics or streaming. We have some connections, integrations with Stream Analytics, and based on our work with Azure SQL Edge and its tight integration with Stream Analytics, I only see this continuing to improve as we go forward. We've got great integrations with the Power Platform. So actually from the portal in an Azure SQL database, you can immediately connect to Power BI or create a Power App or Power Automate flow. And again, this is like low code things that, are meant to be able to be done by just about everyone. So that's awesome capabilities you have right off the bat. We also have integrations with things like Azure DevOps. So you can integrate this into your CI/CD workflows. Even GitHub Actions. We have an Azure SQL action in GitHub if you're using GitHub to do your builds. A few other things on here. You can very easily hook up to things like Azure Databricks and Azure Machine Learning. Note, I'm not referring to machine learning services for SQL. This is an Azure service, which also includes something called automated machine learning. So really a lot of capabilities that you can start to take advantage of right off the bat once you're in Azure. I'm not going to go through all of them up here. But in addition to this, Bob talked about automation. There are a lot of automation capabilities, whether it's related to notification and alerting and monitoring, but also just related to running tasks that you have to run on a regular basis. We have this service called Azure Runbooks. And actually recently I did a video with Erin Stiletto, who's MVP in the Microsoft community, and she showed me on an episode of Data Expose how to use runbooks with Azure SQL Database. So there's a lot of things for you to do once you're in the cloud, and also kind of extend to your on-premises environment.
Anna, what I love about that story is not the fact that any of these icons here you talk about just connect to SQL. I mean, anybody can just kind of connect to SQL TDS. It's the fact that you mentioned that we've built in integration points to almost everything you see, whether it's an Azure template or something very, very specific like Azure Data Factory, where you can go to the documentation and say, how do you do ADF with Azure SQL? So we're trying to help you, right? And imagine also, Anna, if you had to do this in your own data center, what if you had to go build up all these services yourself and then just use them with Azure SQL? Again, it's the power of being inside that Azure ecosystem. I thought it'd be kind of interesting, though, to take a look at an example of hooking this together, because you're not going to just take a bunch of icons and say, oh, I'll just want some of this, I want some of that. You usually have a solution, kind of like the scenarios that we've been talking about today, that you want to build. And Anna, the scenarios that we talked about so far in our challenges were a little bit focused towards database, right? But what if you had a business scenario like IoT edge devices? Like you wanted to take data from some sort of IoT device, and you'd like to build a solution where you can look at streaming data, you can analyze streaming data, you can aggregate it, you can run reporting on it, you need to hook up Active Directory access to all of it, you want to do machine learning models to this, or even go and build some business logic applications. So we thought we would show you an example of how this works and how all of these touch points are Azure services that you can deploy. And again, we have specific examples of how you would wire this together. Notice Azure SQL database being in part of this diagram where data transformation occurs from Azure functions, but we have templates for you to go in and talk about how would you take an Azure function and connect to an Azure SQL database. And the other thing about this example, Anna, that's pretty cool is that we literally have a GitHub source code example. So you could take this example right here, go to GitHub, see all the source code for this, and then modify this towards your needs. It's also interesting to note that we've announced Azure SQL Edge at our build conference. So imagine now on the left side of this diagram, even now bringing in other assets like Azure SQL Edge on the devices themselves, and then bolting it in to the solution. So I love the fact that we have other places in our documentation where we have these architecture guides that show you how to wire a potential solution, take our GitHub source code, and then modify to your needs.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. I think this has been really interesting. And what we're going to do now is we're going to shift just slightly, and we're going to do an Ask Me Anything. And notice I put your name on here, Bob. We're going to focus on you.
Wait, how did that happen? Another Anna surprise. Bob
I just snuck that in there. But I'll be here as well. But
feel free to say, Anna, you take this one. How's that sound?
Great.
Yeah, let's get some of them, please.
All right, so let's get started. The first question is there a way to monitor application intent connections for read-only databases in the business critical tier of managed instance?
Let's go back and think about monitoring that we talked about, monitoring capabilities, right? And we said in monitoring, we have Azure interfaces and then we have SQL Server interfaces, right? So as it turns out, you can do auditing to go audit even things like connections, and this kind of type property could be something you could look at. You could use X events to go trace logins that are coming in and see properties of this nature. DMVs will have some of these properties that you listed out. So yes, the answer is that you can definitely do all of this stuff. And because of the fact that you have Azure interfaces and SQL, any of this can be automated through PowerShell, through Azure CLI, or through your own T-SQL scripts, even with agent jobs or something. So yeah, I would say we have a breadth of solutions to help you do what you want to do there.
Awesome, thanks. This next question, and I can potentially dive in on this one too, is do you find getting certifications in training for Azure to be valuable?
Yeah, Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, and it depends how you learn, but for me, putting the pressure of getting some sort of certification or a test is really going to help motivate me to actually learn stuff. Similarly, getting up and doing a presentation. So taking, a piece of this boot camp and presenting it to your local community at a SQL Saturday or a user group. I think those sort of things are really valuable for learning. And there are two certs that I recommend. One is the DP300. Going through this Azure SQL Bootcamp, you're ready for a lot of it. It's, specifically related, I believe, to Azure SQL and Azure SQL Database. So I would say, go ahead and check out that one. It's DP300. And once you're feeling confident with that, there's also the DP900. I think that's the Azure Fundamentals one, as you start to expand and look at other pieces of Azure. What do you think, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, certifications absolutely have their purpose and their need for a lot of people. If I was somebody, quite frankly, right now that was a consultant in the industry, and I was trying to prove to a customer, hire me, right, for my Azure skills, this is an easy way to demonstrate to somebody that I have the knowledge, at least from a foundational level, to go do this, besides just experience and things that I'm working with my customers. So, and I love the fact that you called out about the boot camp and the tie-in, because I believe we even talked to some of the folks that run these programs about, can the boot camp be used as some foundational knowledge? And I think they're very receptive to that.
Definitely. All right, this is a good one. Bob, can you explain the main differences when we think about high availability versus DR or disaster recovery in Azure?
Sure, absolutely. Think of it from this perspective. You want to make sure your application can connect to SQL Server as much as possible with very little downtime, right? Just to SQL. Forget about the databases themselves, right? Forget about the data on disk. So that's what high availability is all about, right? Although high availability, depending on the option you pick, gives you protection in some cases like replica designs. But disaster recovery, is all about loss of something. So you can get high availability from general purpose already. We talked about that, right? The fact that if a SQL server has a problem, we can spin up another SQL server node for you. But what if you have a problem with accidentally dropping your database? That's actually disaster recovery. People think about disaster recovery just being that a hurricane comes in and knocks something out. But what if you actually drop your database? Now it's not a matter of availability. SQL Server's running great, but Anna went in and dropped my database. I'll pick on Anna today. I can pick on others, right? But Anna dropped my database. I have a disaster situation I need to recover from, and this is where our automated backup solutions, come into play. So It's usually viewed in combination, but SQL could be highly available all the time, but you can't get access to your data because of disaster recovery. But also think in terms of disaster recovery of what we talked about, like availability zones, but regions. If a region went down, like the entire data center went down or something, now you're in a mode where you maybe need to do a geo restore of your database to get it back up and running. We offer that kind of flexibility. So if you think about what we talked about, we talk in terms of backup and restores and automation there as part of the DR story, and about the fact that we're using fault tolerance in the Azure ecosystem and things like availability groups for your availability purposes. So, and even accelerated database recovery is part of availability. Nothing to do with is your data available? It's whether SQL Server is available.
Awesome. Now, this next question from Steven, he asked, what type of workloads would you not move, note the hint there, not move to Azure yet, i.e. what is best left for on-prem for now?
What do you think, Anna?
Oh, it's a tough one. I mean, I want to say, everyone move everything to the cloud, but we understand that sometimes there are limitations in doing that.
I mean, the number one thing that sticks out to me is I've heard customers say from a privacy perspective or a compliance perspective, or I've got data center investments I've made that I'm not ready to not use anymore, right? Like the third one's a good one. Because by the way, for privacy and trust and so forth, people don't realize the compliance we offer. I mean, even think of just about Azure DoD regions and so forth, right? For the Department of Defense. So, privacy and compliance, I have heard that come up before, but I think people will be surprised on how much compliance and trust and things that we've got available for you. We have a trust center for Azure that talks about all the compliance offerings for all the industry and government standards that may meet your needs. I've heard more from people saying, look, I've got this data center investment here, and I'm not ready to just kind of give that up. So take heart, though, for this, if that's something you're doing. And that is that SQL Server 2019, our latest version, is very much in line with what we have in the cloud, right? So all that great functionality exists if you need to deploy SQL Server there.
Awesome. This next one, I like this one. And this is a common question that we get. It's from Avi. They ask, with SQL Server moving to the cloud and becoming platform as a service, do you think there will be less work for DBAs? And what skills do you suggest aspiring DBAs to take up?
That is a great one. And a lot of people ask us those questions all the time now, right? I want you to think, Avi, in terms of what we told you we take care of and you don't worry about. Physical file placement, right? We just do that now. Virtual machine configuration if you're using the PaaS offerings. We just do all that stuff now. Many of the different configuration choices that you have to make in SQL Server, we just do that now. Setting up an availability group, setting up a failover cluster. But think about the stuff that we talked about that you still need to do. Even though we have some automation to help you with performance, you still need to do, we remember the comment we had in there, Anna, about tune it like it's SQL Server? To me, it's usually around performance, but even the choices you have to make to deploy this thing, I think that's really important. Understanding when you should use business critical, general availability. Think about the scenarios that we talked about. I think maybe people that are DBAs could learn to become more architect type folks when it comes to Azure, because you're going to learn how to bolt the things that we've provided for you in a solution. But there's still some tried and true skills for SQL, especially around performance, I think, that apps still apply in the cloud.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, I spoke with Joe Sack about this topic exactly. And what he told me is he said our SQL Server professionals, our SQL Server community could save a lot of people a lot of money with just some basic performance tuning skills that you have and are just very, innate to what you all know. So I think there's certainly a huge market for that with our customers. A lot of customers potentially are over provisioning when some tuning could just help them a lot.
That's a great call out.
This next question is from Eddie, and Eddie asked, in general purpose serverless, what are the certain conditions, i.e. hitting limit of CPU threshold after X seconds to scale down the number of vCores or vCPU? That's a great question.
It's a really good question. So I want you to think in terms of scaling with serverless in terms of billing for a second. So when you pick a min vCore and a max vCore, typically, as much as possible, we kind of have that max vCore around available to you so you can use it, okay? But you get billed for what you use, okay? So if you pick a minimum 2 vCores and a max of 8 vCores, and you really are not using this, and you don't have this set to be paused, we're going to bill you kind of for that min vCore level. And then as you scale and need more vCores, we'll bill you up towards what you're using in that max scenario. And then if you have pause turned on, the lowest number of the lowest measurement or threshold for pausing is an hour. So after an hour, if we detect there's no connections, it's all idle, no one's using this thing, we will literally pause your workload. And a lot of times this comes, and we won't bill you for compute during that, but a lot of times this doesn't come down to CPUs, but memory actually, Anna. So, there are memory resources you're using, and we may reclaim some of those memory resources for other deployments. And so therefore, when you scale back up after you pause, you're going to have literally a cold cache to work from, and you got to warm back up your application. So it's usually memory reclamation that becomes an issue here. But in terms of scaling down CPUs, it's not like typically we're taking your VM and saying, oh, you only get 2 now, and we got to go back and change your VM. It's possible. We don't guarantee the fact that you'll always have that max, but that's typically what we try to do.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Let's see. This is an interesting one. Do you have more tips on how we can check security of our deployment? Does Azure have any tools that can help?
Absolutely. Let's talk about just Azure overall. We talked about the Azure Security Center. Number one thing out of the gate you're going to end up doing when you're working with Azure is it's unlikely you're going to have one database. Your company is going to have several different Azure resources. So Azure Security Center is beautiful because it has this huge picture of what you're doing across all your Azure enterprises, including alerts and notifications and all sorts of great stuff. Think about what we talked about in the security section. We talked about auditing, using SQL audit with Azure SQL, and actually including that with a log analytics dashboard. That was pretty cool. But think also about advanced data security. We had a vulnerability assessment that you could go run to go check on your deployment. We had the ability to do advanced threat protection. That is really one huge tool in the cloud that's specific to Azure, where you can even set up thresholds and alerts on things like SQL injection attacks, brute force attacks, unfamiliar principles trying to get into your SQL deployment. I've actually seen that in my Azure SQL deployments where all of a sudden I'm alerted that somebody's trying to attack a virtual machine or Azure SQL deployment I had, and I love the fact that I had ADS to go take a look at those things. So we've got a wide range of tools. Don't forget about the SQL Server tools, though, you still have, right? SQL Server auditing, et cetera, to help you go look at these things, and data classification. So a lot of Azure tools available, a lot of SQL tools to kind of help check the security on what you're doing in Azure.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. I'm just looking through. There are a few questions coming through here.
Okay.
Give me one moment. Okay, this is a good one, and I'm not sure if I can get it up on the screen, but maybe the moderators can help me. This question is from Nima, and it says, how about data hacking protection in Azure? Particularly bank data. Financial institutions sometimes are still scared to move to the cloud. Can you share your insights?
This is where the security playbook, Anna, is really good for somebody like that. And then I'm going to let you comment on some thoughts about, even though we never go into details, and we can't go into details on things that we're doing that we haven't announced yet, but we have thoughts around this, right? I'm going to let you comment on that part. But what we have today is some pretty good stuff, right? Think about all the things we described to you about protecting data. Whether it's setting up proper network security, it all starts with that. It's always about setting up network security, right? It's defense in depth. So it starts with network security, and then it goes into securing your Azure SQL deployments with functionality like always encrypted, setting up the right encryption schemes, setting up the right authentication schemes, and then it's all about the alerting, right? And the advanced threat protection alerting to kind of see what's going on there. So it's configuring about how people get in, about how people get access to the data in your deployment, and then monitoring what anybody's doing. So that's kind of my view of that. And we've even seen high-profile customers, healthcare, banks, take a look at what we have and like, but we're also thinking down the road about other things.
Yeah, definitely. The only other thing that I'll add when you talk about hacking protection, and this is public, you can go read about it, but we actually have teams in Microsoft whose job it is to try to hack into our system. So we are doing, we're always working on something to make our services even more protected and to identify any potential issues that might come up. But I would also just check out the certifications and compliance standards that we do
Yep.
meet, because it's a lot.
And it includes the financial industry. Several of those are in there for that.
Definitely. Now, this next question is from Wasim. They ask, is Azure Administrator and Azure DBA the same?
That's an interesting question. I want you to think, Wazim, at least this is the way I'll answer that. Think in terms of what we talked about in terms of RBAC and Azure SQL. So think about first your data center. If you're a DBA for SQL Server, typically they just don't give you the server, right? Or the host with all the VMs in it, and sometimes not even the VM. You just get pointed to a SQL Server connection, you pop up Management Studio. You may only be given a database, not even the SQL Server. Once you think of that same model in Azure, somebody has to have the right to deploy a database or an instance or even a VM. And that's when the Azure ecosystem comes into play. So think in terms of an administrator of an Azure account, for example, giving right. Let's say that I am the administrator of my account in Azure, which is the case. So I give Anna permissions, actually today, it's a true story. I have to think about that, Anna. Actually, I hold something over you, so you better be nice to me the rest of this call. So I give Anna permissions to go deploy as a contributor role in my subscription to deploy Azure SQL resources. I could control, I could even say, Anna only gets to deploy in this region, or even limit quotas on her of what she gets to deploy, right? So that's, to me, an administrator over all of Azure that could be done and can look from that perspective. And then once I give her the right RBAC roles, then within her deployment, she gets to decide what she does within that. But we even have RBAC roles to separate that. You can even say, hey, you're allowed to deploy Azure SQL or managed instance, but I'm not going to give you permission to go use it. Or I'm going to give you permissions only to monitor the security of my Azure assets for Azure SQL and not actually deploy databases or even use those databases. So I think we have both the overall Azure administration functionality and even what somebody would traditionally referred to as database administration functionality within Azure SQL.
Yeah, definitely. And if you're looking for more information on those different RBAC roles and what we have built in versus what you might want to do yourself, you should definitely go check out Module 3 of this bootcamp, which I believe was on day 2, or you can check the security module in the Microsoft Learning Path. Has some more information about that.
Absolutely.
Now, this next question, and I think we probably have time for a few more questions, is Azure DMVs are different from, let me rephrase. How are Azure DMVs different from on-premises DMVs?
Well, I should take that one because when we went to that section, you said, Bob, I know you're hyper-focused about DMVs. Remember what a DMV is, by the way? A DMV being a dynamic management view, which is us abstracting memory structures typically inside the SQL Server engine and you running a query against it and looking at it like a table. So here's the good news for you. With Azure SQL Managed Instance, and Anna, it's so funny, Anna, because you've seen me do the row counts on this stuff. I've actually looked up how many DMVs exist in SQL Server from a row count perspective in the object list, how many exist in Managed Instance and database. So for Managed Instances, it turns out there's even more than SQL Server, but think of those as a one-on-one correlation. Every DMV in SQL Server you get in Managed Instance. Now for Azure Database, you don't get all of them, but all the ones you need are there. And I say that tongue-in-cheek. DM exec requests, things of that nature, OS wait stats, things that you use all the time are going to be there in database. One of the reasons that we can't let you get access in database to all of those like a managed instance is that we're not going to give you access to the underlying dedicated instance that's supporting your database. And so we can't do all of those kind of type things. And so you're going to get things, but you're going to get things sometimes that feel like surface area instance level things like DMS wait stats just from the context of your database. So I think you'll love the DMV story. It's very good. And don't forget that there are new DMVs in Azure that are not in SQL Server because we want to expose things to you like your resource stats or your resource governance that's part of your resource limits. So new DMVs, same DMVs, and in some case, a subset of DMVs.
Awesome. Now, this next question, we might not have enough information. So, Nelson, I might ask you to follow up with us. But the question is, why is it that copying SQL tables 25 megabytes in size from on-prem via point-to-point VPN using a private endpoint and redirect to Azure SQL database take a long time, about 25 minutes? What should I be looking out for? And Bob, I'll let you take a stab at this as well. But what I would say is I would go back to module 2, where we talk about deploy and configure. We have a whole section on loading data and actually a hands-on lab where you can see some tips and tricks for how you can better load data. And maybe, Bob, if you want to share a few tips as well. But one is just, maybe the way you're inserting that data could be optimized.
Yeah, you're right, Anna. I mean, I don't know what copying SQL table means, right? Could mean a lot of different things. Just keep one thing in mind, that we have to use full recovery for Azure SQL Database and Azure Managed Instance. So we cannot do minimally logged operations or fully logged. So for example, you should use a batching when doing bulk type operations. Also keep in mind that we found it to be more effective that if you do this on a continuous basis, it might be more effective for you if the source of the data is like a file, is to use Azure storage concepts to compress and get that file into Azure storage. And then within Azure SQL, bulk it from the Azure storage. That's going to typically be a faster operation. I've just seen it in many, many different cases.
Awesome. All right. Looks like I have one more question.
Okay.
This question is, what is the most valuable skill I can learn to move to a DBA role? And then the second part of that is, what are the high value skills in the job market today?
It's an interesting question. It's funny because a lot of people have asked us, is a DBA role still valid anymore? I think it goes back to what we said earlier. If you think in terms of this question for Azure SQL, first of all, I believe right now, if you start going and learning Azure, and use this bootcamp as a way to do it, by the way, and start understanding the Azure ecosystem plus Azure SQL together, your skills are extremely valuable in the job market right now. A lot of people out there want to know, they're a company right now, they say, how do I move to the cloud? I'm a SQL Server shop and I got to move to the cloud, some of this to the cloud. Understanding the differences between SQL Server and Azure SQL is extremely important. Understanding the path to migrate, including the application, is very important. And then understanding all the things we talked about, how to optimize yourself within Azure. The last thing I would say is, and Anna, I want you to chime in as well, is don't think in terms of just SQL Server. We just talked about this. Once you're in Azure, how do you go further with the cloud? How do you use all those great Azure services to tie into this Azure SQL from an overall business scenario to make this successful? So, I would say that you should learn in terms of how to become very proficient in deploying, configuring, securing, making performant, making available an Azure SQL deployment. Just start with those foundations first. I think you're going to be amazed at how many people are going to want that skill set. It's my personal opinion.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. And hopefully we've given you a toolbox of things that you can use to get to that point. I think it's actually a great lead-in into what we're going to share next. We have a few things left today, but one of them is just we wanted to talk about some resources. Now, we've been throwing a lot of resources at you in the chat and talking about all these different things, but just wanted to take a few moments to clarify what those different resources are, how you can continue learning after this boot camp, and then we have a fun call to action. So the first is Microsoft Learn. So you've heard me mention, a bunch of times that we have all of this available with free hands-on labs. You just need an Azure account, and then you can do all of this in an Azure sandbox for free. You get those in time box sections. So basically you can do 4 hours at a time. And then you come back and you can deploy again. I think you get like 20 sandboxes in a day. Additionally, we talked about our GitHub resources. Now, this is a great place to go if you want to redeliver any of this content, which we would love for you to do that. And you could even shoot us a mail or tag us on Twitter. We'd love to hear how it's going if you redeliver this content. There are also some deep networking labs as well as a few other things in the GitHub site that aren't in Microsoft Learn. So if you want to go a little bit deeper, you can go there. Also, the slides are all in that GitHub resource, so the SQL Workshops BC. Then we have this how to choose tool. This is like a new, more of a marketing page, but what this is kind of interesting. It gives you a few questions which you can answer, and then it will basically say, oh, we think maybe hyperscale is a good solution for you. And that kind of can give you a starting point as you do your research. Azure SQL Docs is a great place to learn anything. I can say myself, I use the docs all the time. Pro tip, whenever I search for something in the docs, I always add Azure SQL Docs, and then I add what I'm searching for, and usually it comes up pretty quickly. Then when we talk about videos, of course, you'll have access to the playlist, which contains all the videos from our Azure SQL Bootcamp this week. So you can go ahead and rewatch or look for things that you found. I believe the recording also has a chat log. So as you watch the video, you can see the chat and the responses that were there. Additionally, Bob and I did this series, I mentioned this before, in very short video chunks, 61 videos. So you can go watch all these videos. You can say, oh, I want to learn specifically again about that networking thing Anna talked about, and you can go find that exact video in that series. And then finally, this is a shameless plug really. I host a show on Microsoft Developer called Data Exposed, and this is where we bring in various SQL PMs, whether it's Azure SQL, SQL Server, Azure Arc, containers. We got some episodes on Edge coming. And really what we do is we bring PMs on and we have them talk about some of the latest things that they're doing and kind of demystify some things around Azure SQL. So that's a great way to stay in touch with what our team is up to and also kind of get your questions answered. And with that, we have a call to action.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize as you talked about those resources, because I've had this question come up. Whether we provide this content on Microsoft Learn, whether we from the bootcamp today, from GitHub, or whether it's in these 61 plus amazing videos, which we had a lot of fun building those, it's the same content, just a slightly variation. It's actually built for you to learn the way that fits you best. So just make sure you understand it's all the same ideas of what is Azure SQL, deploy, configure, security, performance, availability, and then these fun challenges we're talking about. So the first call to action is try this stuff. Go through this training. Try out Azure. There's no excuse. People came to us before and said, I can't try out Azure because I really can't afford my Azure subscription to try this. But with Microsoft Learn now in our sandbox, you can actually go through that process. And then when I've talked to customers, pick a workload. I've had customers who were like, never moved to Azure before. They don't know what to do. Where do I even start? So pick a small workload in your organization and go through the pre-deployment planning exercises. Decide and get used to your own checklist for how to decide what to use when for your small workload. Get used to that experience, and then it'll just roll itself on other workloads for sure. And that kind of involves doing a proof of concept. You may decide to take a small database, move it to the cloud, and just kind of play with it a little bit. But then you may decide to do a proof of concept like the IoT architecture we talked about, or maybe something a little more fundamental. Like I'd like to build a geo system with an application with Traffic Manager or something. I'd like to go through that process. And if you look at this bullet point here, one of the things I see missing from this conversation with many SQL Server professionals is the need for you to test your toolbox. Most people will go out there and deploy Azure SQL, deploy an application, start testing it and trying it. But remember, and I know I've seen this before, you out there have many scripts, many different programs, many different processes, things that you use today to maintain, monitor, and manage your SQL Server deployment. Go test that stuff on Azure SQL. Make sure it works and meets the needs of what you need to do. Now, if you've looked at this list, Anna, it sounds like I'm asking you just to test Azure. We've already heard about customer stories in earlier discussions here. We think it's ready for you. We think it's the world's database, and we have big time customers out there in production workloads today running across these different deployment options. So, we don't want to give you away the feeling that it's just this little test environment and you can only just throw something out there small. We're just telling you, if you've never started, maybe start small, but we think it is ready for production workloads today. And we wouldn't be saying that if we didn't believe it.
Yeah, we have millions of databases running in the Azure SQL platform. So it's certainly, Azure is ready for you. It's a great statement. And I love that Bob's coined this, Azure SQL is the world's database. And we'll just keep keep throwing that out there. Just some final words. We really want to thank you all for spending so much time with us. We know times are crazy, so we really appreciate it. We want to thank our moderators and, again, the Microsoft Learn team, including Rob Gibbons. If you want to stay up to date with us, you can feel free to follow us or reach out to us on Twitter. You should also follow Azure SQL to get all the latest updates, whether it's SQL Server, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, and use the hashtag Azure SQL. You can also use the hashtag from the scenarios if you go through and you come up with a different solution. We will be monitoring those hashtags. And last but not least, please let us know what you thought of this bootcamp, whether it was good or bad. It's really going to help us. And we've broken it up into day by day, so you can just review the days that you actually attended. And again, we really thank you, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bob, do you have any closing thoughts to add?
Yeah, just Anna, thank you. To be candid with you, Anna's the one that challenged me way back at the start of this year to do Azure SQL assessments with SQL Server, but I had no idea it would lead to 61 videos, a boot camp, GitHub, Microsoft Learn. So Anna, thank you for challenging all of us to provide all of this in so many different forms and ways and get this out to the community. Thank you, our moderators. Thank you again, Rob, for driving this. But thank you most for the community. Without you, we don't have a product or a service. So we're serious about taking this feedback, interacting with us on Twitter, interacting with us with other medias. We want to hear from you. We want to know if we're meeting the needs for what you need out there in the community. So thank you all in the SQL family.
Thanks, Bob. And again, we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, night, morning, whatever it is where you are. And please be in touch, and we'll see you later.